Jonathan Hale was one of the richest men in the country. His name was known in newspapers, business magazines, and television interviews. People often talked about how he built a huge business empire from almost nothing. He owned tall office buildings, luxury hotels, private jets, and many companies. To the outside world, Jonathan Hale seemed like a man who had everything anyone could ever dream of. But on a quiet Monday morning, something happened that changed his life forever. Jonathan sat in a large hospital room that was clean, silent, and bright. The room looked expensive, just like everything else in his life. Outside the tall glass window, the city moved as usual, cars rushing through traffic, people walking quickly to their jobs, and life continuing like nothing was wrong. But inside that room, time felt heavy and slow. 3 doctors stood across from him. They were some of the best specialists in the country, people Jonathan himself had paid millions to hire over the years. Normally, these doctors spoke with confidence. Today, their faces looked serious and uncomfortable. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He was used to hearing bad news in business meetings, but he always found a way to fix things. Problems could be solved with money, power, or smart decisions. That had always been his rule. Finally, the oldest doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale," he said gently, "we have reviewed all your tests very carefully." Jonathan nodded calmly. "And?" The room became even quieter. "I'm afraid the illness has progressed very quickly," the doctor continued. "It's a rare and aggressive condition. We have tried every treatment available." Jonathan frowned slightly. "So what are you saying?" The doctor looked down for a moment before speaking again. "You have about 2 days left to live." For a moment, Jonathan thought he had heard the words wrong. 2 days. That didn't make sense. He had billions of dollars. He had access to the best hospitals in the world. People traveled from other countries just to work for him. How could something as simple as time suddenly become something he couldn't buy? He gave a small laugh, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. 2 days. Jonathan repeated. "You must be joking." None of the doctors smiled. One of them slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale." The words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time in decades, Jonathan Hale felt something he had not felt in a very long time: fear. Not the kind of fear he felt during risky business deals or stock market crashes. This was different. This was the kind of fear that made everything else in the world suddenly feel small and meaningless. He stood up and walked toward the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. His expensive suit, his perfectly styled gray hair, and the gold watch on his wrist all looked the same as they had yesterday. But now everything was different. 2 days. 48 hours. That was all. Behind him, the doctors quietly explained that they would keep him comfortable and monitor his condition, but Jonathan barely heard them. His mind had already drifted somewhere else. Memories began to appear one by one. He remembered the small apartment where he grew up as a child. His parents worked long hours just to pay rent. Back then, Jonathan promised himself that he would become rich one day so he would never struggle again. And he did. But while chasing success, he had lost many things along the way. Old friends stopped calling him. Family gatherings slowly disappeared. Even his own relatives rarely visited unless there was something they wanted from him. His mansion was full of expensive art, rare furniture, and beautiful rooms, but most of the time it felt empty. Jonathan suddenly realized something strange. He had spent his entire life building a powerful empire, yet now that his life was ending, he couldn't think of many people who truly cared about him. The doctors eventually left the room quietly, giving him space. Jonathan remained standing by the window for a long time. The busy city below continued moving without him. People laughed, argued, worked, and hurried through their normal lives. None of them knew that one of the richest men in the city had just learned he would soon be gone. For years, Jonathan believed money could control everything. But now he understood something painful. Money could buy houses, companies, and luxury. But it could not buy more time. And for the first time in his powerful life, Jonathan Hale did not know what to do next. The news stayed in Jonathan Hale's mind like a heavy shadow. After leaving the hospital, he returned to his enormous mansion on the hill overlooking the city. The house had always been a symbol of his success. It had tall gates, beautiful gardens, marble floors, and rooms filled with expensive paintings and decorations collected from around the world. But that evening, the mansion felt strangely quiet. As Jonathan walked through the large entrance hall, his footsteps echoed in the empty space. A few house staff members greeted him politely, but their voices sounded distant. They had always treated him with respect, but their conversations were short and formal, as if they were careful not to say too much. Jonathan slowly walked into the living room. The room was huge, with tall windows, soft leather sofas, and a large fireplace. On one wall hung a giant television, and on another wall were framed photos from his business achievements, pictures of him shaking hands with powerful leaders, standing in front of new company buildings, and smiling during award ceremonies. For many years, these pictures made him feel proud. Today, they only reminded him of how quickly time had passed. He sat down on one of the sofas and stared at the photos for a long moment. In every picture, he looked confident and powerful. People around him were smiling, cameras flashing, reporters asking questions. But none of those moments showed the long nights he spent working alone. None of them showed the birthdays he missed with family. None of them showed the friendships that slowly disappeared as his business grew bigger. Jonathan leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. 2 days. The number kept repeating in his mind. Suddenly, the mansion that once felt like a palace now felt more like a giant empty shell. He decided to walk through the house, something he rarely did. Usually, he stayed in his office or traveled to meetings around the world. But tonight, he had nothing else to do except think. He walked past the dining room where a long table could seat 20 people. The table was polished perfectly, but it had not been used for a real family dinner in years. He remembered a time when he planned to invite relatives and old friends for celebrations. But business meetings, international trips, and new projects always came first. Slowly, the invitations stopped. Next, he passed a music room that held a grand piano. Many years ago, his younger sister loved playing music and once asked if she could practice there whenever she visited. Jonathan had promised he would make time for family more often. But the visits never really happened. The piano now sat silently, covered with a thin layer of dust. As Jonathan continued walking, he reached his large home office. This room had been the center of his life for decades. It was where he made billion-dollar decisions, signed contracts, and planned new companies. The walls were covered with shelves full of awards and trophies. At the time he received them, each one felt important. Now they looked like simple pieces of metal and glass. Jonathan sat at his desk and opened a drawer filled with old letters and documents. Some were messages from people asking for help, charity organizations, small business owners, and even old acquaintances who had fallen on hard times. He remembered ignoring many of them. Not because he hated those people, but because he was always too busy. His mind was always focused on the next deal, the next project, the next success. He always believed there would be time later to help others. But now, later had almost disappeared. A strange feeling began growing inside him. Regret. For the first time, Jonathan wondered if his life had been unbalanced. He had spent so many years chasing wealth and power that he forgot to build real connections with people. Money had brought him respect, but not true friendship. It had given him luxury, but not warmth. Jonathan looked around the quiet office. If he truly had only 2 days left, who would come to see him? Would anyone sit beside him simply because they cared? Or would most people only remember him as the billionaire who owned many companies? The thought made his chest feel heavy. Outside the window, the sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with orange and purple colors. The city lights began turning on one by one. Jonathan realized something painful in that moment. For all the years he spent building an empire, he had forgotten something very simple. A person could be surrounded by wealth and still feel completely alone. The next morning felt strangely different for Jonathan Hale. Normally, his days started with phone calls, meetings, and assistants rushing around his office with schedules and documents. But today, there were no urgent business decisions waiting for him. No investors calling. No reporters asking for interviews. For the first time in many years, Jonathan woke up with nothing planned. He sat quietly near the large window in his bedroom, watching the city slowly come to life below the hill. The sun had just begun to rise, spreading soft golden light across the buildings and streets. People were starting their daily routines, driving to work, opening shops, walking their children to school. Life outside continued as if nothing had changed. But Jonathan knew his life was now measured in hours. He had barely touched the breakfast placed on the table beside him when someone knocked gently on the door. It was his head of security, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins had worked for Jonathan for more than 15 years. He was a serious man who rarely disturbed Jonathan unless something important had happened. "Sir," Collins said politely, standing at the door, "there's a small situation at the front gate." Jonathan turned his chair slightly. "What kind of situation?" Collins hesitated for a moment, which was unusual for him. "There's a child outside the gate," he explained. "An orphan, according to the staff nearby. The boy has been insisting that he must speak with you." Jonathan frowned slightly. "A child," he repeated. "Yes, sir." "That's strange," Jonathan said quietly. "Why would an orphan want to meet me?" Collins shook his head. "We tried to send him away, sir. But he refuses to leave. He says the meeting is very important." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, thinking. Normally, he would have told security to handle the situation and move the child away from the property. Wealthy people like him often attracted strangers asking for help, money, or favors. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because he had only 2 days left to live. Maybe it was because, for the first time in his life, he had time to listen. "What exactly did he say?" Jonathan asked. Collins looked at a small notebook in his hand. He said, "Mr. Hale must see what I brought. It belongs to him." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Belongs to him?" That made even less sense. "Did he say his name?" Jonathan asked. "No, sir. He only said that you would understand once you see what he brought." Jonathan stood up slowly and walked toward the window again. From his bedroom, he could not see the front gate, but he imagined the scene, his massive iron gates, security guards standing nearby, and a small orphan child waiting outside. He felt a strange curiosity growing inside him. "What does the boy look like?" Jonathan asked. "About 10 or 11 years old," Collins replied. "Very thin. His clothes look worn, and he's carrying an old backpack." Jonathan stayed silent for a moment. A poor orphan standing outside the home of one of the richest men in the country. The situation sounded almost unreal. What if he's just another kid asking for money? Jonathan asked quietly. "That's possible, sir," Collins admitted. "But he doesn't look like he's begging. He's just waiting, very patiently." Jonathan slowly turned around. For some reason, the idea of the boy waiting outside the gate touched something inside him. Maybe it was the thought that someone had come to see him when almost no one else had. Or maybe it was simple curiosity. After all, he didn't have many hours left. "Bring him inside," Jonathan said calmly. Collins looked slightly surprised. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. "Let him come in." Collins nodded and left the room. A few minutes later, Jonathan walked down to the main hall of the mansion. The tall doors opened, and soft morning light filled the room. He waited quietly. Soon, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. 2 security guards entered first, and behind them stood a small boy. The child looked exactly as Collins had described, thin, tired, and wearing old clothes that looked too big for him. His shoes were worn out, and a small backpack hung loosely over one shoulder. But what caught Jonathan's attention the most was the boy's eyes. They were not afraid. Instead, they looked determined. The boy stepped forward slowly and looked directly at Jonathan Hale. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jonathan broke the silence. "You insisted on seeing me," he said calmly. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." Jonathan studied him carefully. "And why is that?" he asked. The boy slowly removed the backpack from his shoulder and held it tightly in his hands. "Because," the child said quietly, "I brought something that belongs to you." Jonathan's curiosity immediately grew stronger. Something that belongs to him? From a poor orphan? That was impossible. Or at least, that's what Jonathan believed. But he had no idea that this small, unexpected visitor was about to reveal something that would change the final hours of his life forever. Jonathan Hale looked carefully at the young boy standing in the middle of his grand hall. The enormous room, with its tall ceilings and shining marble floors, made the child look even smaller. Sunlight came through the large windows, lighting the room softly, but the atmosphere felt tense and mysterious. The boy held his worn backpack tightly with both hands, as if it contained something extremely important. Jonathan slowly walked a few steps closer. Up close, he could see that the boy's clothes were old and slightly torn, but they were clean. His hair looked messy, and his shoes had clearly been used for a long time. Yet there was something unusual about him. He didn't look frightened by the luxury around him. Instead, he looked focused. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked calmly. The boy hesitated for a second. "My name is Daniel," he said quietly. Jonathan nodded slightly. "Well, Daniel," Jonathan continued, "you insisted on meeting me. My staff said you brought something that belongs to me." Daniel slowly nodded. "Yes, sir." Jonathan glanced at the backpack again. "And what exactly is that?" For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. His fingers tightened around the straps of the bag. It seemed like he was gathering courage before speaking again. "It's something very important," the boy said. Jonathan crossed his arms, curious but also confused. "Important how?" he asked. Daniel looked around the massive hall for a moment. His eyes moved across the expensive paintings, the crystal chandeliers, and the beautiful furniture that filled the room. It was clear that he had never been inside a place like this before. But strangely, he still didn't look impressed by the wealth. He looked serious. "My mother told me to bring it to you," Daniel finally said. Jonathan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Your mother?" Daniel nodded again, but his voice became softer. "She passed away last week." The words made the room suddenly feel heavier. Jonathan paused for a moment. Even though he had never met this child before, hearing that he had lost his mother touched something inside him. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jonathan said quietly. Daniel looked down at the floor for a second before speaking again. "Before she died," he continued, "she told me that if anything ever happened to her, I must come find you." Jonathan felt confusion growing in his mind. Find him? Why would a dying woman send her child to him? "What was your mother's name?" Jonathan asked. Daniel looked up again. "Her name was Maria." Jonathan searched his memory quickly. The name didn't immediately mean anything to him. He had met thousands of people during his life, employees, investors, partners, workers, assistants, and strangers who crossed his path for a brief moment. "Maria," Jonathan repeated slowly. But nothing came to mind. Daniel seemed to notice the confusion on his face. "She said you might not remember her," the boy said. That only made the mystery deeper. Jonathan stepped closer and looked directly at the boy. "Then maybe you should explain," he said calmly. Daniel slowly opened the zipper of his backpack. The quiet sound of the zipper sliding open echoed softly in the large hall. Both security guards near the door watched carefully, but Jonathan raised his hand slightly, signaling them to stay calm. The boy reached inside the bag. For a moment, Jonathan wondered what could possibly be inside. His mind imagined different things: a letter, a photograph, maybe even something that belonged to the boy's mother. Daniel carefully pulled out a small object wrapped in an old piece of cloth. He held it gently, almost as if it were something fragile or precious. "This is what my mother told me to give you," Daniel said. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "Why would she give something to me?" Daniel slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small, old metal object. At first glance, it looked simple and worn by time. But the moment Jonathan saw it clearly, his expression changed. His eyes widened. For several seconds, he said nothing. The object lying in Daniel's hands was something Jonathan had not seen in many years. Something he believed had been lost forever. Something connected to a part of his life he had almost completely forgotten. Jonathan felt his heart beating faster. "How?" he whispered quietly. "How did you get that?" Daniel looked at him with calm eyes. "My mother kept it safe for many years," the boy said. Jonathan stared at the small object again, his mind suddenly filled with distant memories. Memories from a time long before he became a billionaire. A time when his life was completely different. And in that moment, Jonathan began to realize something shocking. This orphan boy standing in front of him was somehow connected to a story from his past that he had never expected to face again. Jonathan Hale could not take his eyes off the small metal object in Daniel's hands. For a moment, the giant mansion around him seemed to disappear, and all he could see was that single item. His heart was beating faster than it had in years. The object was an old silver key. It looked simple, slightly scratched, and worn by time, but Jonathan recognized it immediately. There was a tiny mark engraved on its side, a symbol he knew very well. He had not seen that key in more than 30 years. Jonathan slowly reached out his hand but stopped just before touching it, as if he was afraid the moment might disappear. "Where did your mother get this?" he asked quietly. Daniel held the key carefully and looked at Jonathan. "She said you gave it to her," the boy replied. Jonathan's mind began racing through memories from his past. He tried to remember every person named Maria he had ever met. At first, nothing was clear. But then, slowly, a distant memory started to return. Many years ago, long before he became famous and powerful, Jonathan had been a young man struggling to build his first small business. At that time, he didn't own luxury cars or private jets. He worked day and night, sometimes barely sleeping, trying to make his idea succeed. Back then, he had rented a small office in a crowded part of the city. Across the street from that office was a tiny cafe where he often went to drink cheap coffee while working on his plans. And that was where he met her. Maria. Jonathan suddenly remembered her clearly. She was the young waitress who worked long hours at the cafe. She was always kind to the customers, even when they were rude or impatient. Jonathan remembered how she would sometimes bring him coffee without charging him when she noticed he looked tired. At the time, Jonathan was so focused on his work that he rarely spoke much, but Maria always greeted him with a warm smile. One night, something unexpected happened. Jonathan had stayed late in his office working on an important project. When he finally left the building, he saw Maria outside the cafe. She looked worried and upset. After asking what was wrong, Maria explained that she had just received terrible news. Her landlord was forcing her to leave her apartment because she couldn't pay the rent. She had nowhere else to go. Jonathan remembered that moment clearly now. He had felt sympathy for her. Even though he didn't have much money himself at the time, he wanted to help. So he gave her the key. It was the key to a small storage apartment he owned nearby. The place wasn't fancy, but it was safe and empty. Jonathan had told her she could stay there until she found a better situation. At the time, it felt like a small act of kindness, something simple that didn't cost him much. After that night, life became busy again. His business suddenly started growing, new opportunities appeared, and he moved to a bigger office in another part of the city. Eventually, he stopped visiting the cafe. And over the years, Maria disappeared from his memory. Until now. Jonathan slowly looked back at Daniel. "So, your mother was Maria," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir." Jonathan felt a strange mix of emotions. He had completely forgotten that small moment of kindness from his past. But clearly, Maria had not. She kept the key all these years? Jonathan asked. Daniel looked down at the object in his hand. "Yes," he said softly. "She said it was the moment that saved her life." Jonathan felt a deep silence fill the room. A single decision he made decades ago, something he barely remembered, had meant everything to someone else. Daniel continued speaking. "My mother said if she never met you that night, she might have ended up on the streets," the boy explained. "She always told me you were the reason she had a chance to build a better life." Jonathan slowly sat down in the chair behind him, still staring at the key. He had spent most of his life believing his biggest achievements were the companies he built and the billions he earned. But now he realized something surprising. One small act of kindness from his younger days had created a story that lasted decades. Jonathan looked at Daniel again. "But why bring this to me now?" he asked gently. Daniel lifted his eyes. "Because my mother told me something else before she died," he said. Jonathan waited. The boy took a deep breath. "She said this key wasn't just something you gave her," Daniel continued. "It was something you would need again, one day." Jonathan felt a chill run through him. Need it again? He had no idea what that could possibly mean. But he was about to find out. Jonathan Hale held the small silver key in his hand, turning it slowly between his fingers. The metal felt cold, but the memories attached to it were suddenly very warm and alive in his mind. He had almost forgotten that night from decades ago, yet for Maria it had been a moment that changed her entire life. He looked back at Daniel, who was standing quietly in front of him. "So your mother told you this key was something I would need again?" Jonathan asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "But why?" "It was just the key to an old apartment. That place probably doesn't even exist anymore." Daniel shook his head slowly. "My mother said it still exists," the boy replied. Jonathan frowned, trying to remember. The apartment had been small and hidden behind an old warehouse building in a quiet neighborhood. After his company started growing, he had moved far away from that area and never thought about the property again. "Did your mother live there all these years?" Jonathan asked. Daniel gently took the backpack again and placed it on the floor. He opened one of the small pockets and pulled out a folded envelope. "No," he said. "She moved later. But she kept this." He handed the envelope to Jonathan. The paper looked old and slightly yellow, as if it had been kept safe for many years. Jonathan carefully opened it. Inside was a small photograph. The photo showed a young woman standing outside a modest building with a shy smile on her face. Next to her stood a much younger Jonathan Hale, wearing a simple jacket and holding a cup of coffee. Jonathan stared at the image, surprised. He didn't even remember someone taking this picture. But there it was, proof of a moment from his past. "My mother kept that picture her whole life," Daniel explained softly. "She always said that was the day someone finally helped her when she had nothing." Jonathan felt a heavy emotion rise in his chest. For years he had believed his greatest impact on the world came from his companies and business success. Yet this photograph told a different story. A simple key. A small apartment. And one kind decision. Those things had meant everything to someone else. Jonathan placed the photograph back into the envelope and looked at Daniel again. "But you said she told you something else," he said gently. "Something about me needing this key." Daniel nodded again, his expression serious. "Yes, sir." The boy reached back into the backpack one more time. This time he pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn, and several pages looked carefully folded. "My mother wrote this before she died," Daniel explained. Jonathan slowly opened the notebook. Inside were handwritten notes in neat, careful writing. Most of the pages described memories, stories about the cafe where Maria worked, the struggles she faced, and how she slowly rebuilt her life. But one page near the end caught Jonathan's attention. It was written more recently. He read the words quietly. "Jonathan Hale once helped me when I had nowhere to go. That small act changed my future. If my son ever meets him, give him the key again. Tell him that the place he gave me is no longer just an apartment. It became something much bigger." Jonathan looked up, confused. "What does that mean?" he asked. Daniel smiled slightly for the first time. "My mother didn't just live there," the boy explained. "She started helping other people there too." Jonathan listened carefully. "At first, she let one other woman stay with her when that woman had nowhere else to go," Daniel continued. "Then another person needed help. And another." Jonathan felt his curiosity growing stronger. Over the years, Daniel said, that small apartment became a safe place for many people who had lost everything. Jonathan's eyes widened slightly. "You mean, a shelter?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The idea surprised Jonathan deeply. A place he had almost forgotten had slowly turned into something meaningful. "My mother said that everything started with your kindness," Daniel said. "And she wanted you to see what it became." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, thinking. For most of his life, he believed success was measured by profits, buildings, and power. But now he was hearing about a completely different kind of success. One that started with a simple key. He looked at Daniel again. "So why bring it back to me now?" Jonathan asked. Daniel answered calmly. "Because my mother said you might need a reminder," he said. "A reminder of what?" Daniel looked directly into Jonathan's eyes. "That even a small act of kindness can grow into something unbelievable." Jonathan felt a deep silence fill the room. And for the first time since hearing about his illness, he felt something different inside his heart. Hope. Jonathan Hale sat back in his massive leather chair, still holding the old key and the worn photograph. He had spent decades believing his life's meaning was in wealth, in the skyscrapers he built, in the contracts he signed, and in the power he held. But now, after seeing what Daniel's mother had done with his simple act of kindness, he felt something he had never felt before, humility. For years, Jonathan had been untouchable. People bowed to him, feared him, or wanted something from him. He had lived in a world built of money and control, yet now he realized that in the end, none of that truly mattered. What mattered was life, people, and the choices that created ripples far beyond one's own understanding. He looked at Daniel, whose small hands clutched his backpack nervously. "Do you know what your mother did?" Jonathan asked quietly. "She didn't just survive. She changed the lives of countless people, and it all started because of me." Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. She said it was your kindness that gave her hope, and she wanted me to show you that even the smallest action can grow into something incredible." Jonathan felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had only 2 days to live, yet for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel fear. He felt purpose. He made a decision. He would spend his final hours not thinking about his fortune, his titles, or his empire, but helping others. He would leave behind more than buildings and money, he would leave a legacy of kindness. Jonathan called his secretary and began making arrangements. He instructed his assistants to transfer part of his fortune to the shelter Daniel's mother had created. He wanted to ensure it would grow even after he was gone. He sent messages to former friends, offering apologies and reconciliation. He personally called people who had been in need but whom he had ignored for years, giving them help quietly, without publicity. As the hours passed, Jonathan felt a calm he hadn't experienced in decades. His massive mansion, once filled with cold luxury, began to feel alive with purpose. Every call he made, every decision to help, reminded him that life wasn't about control or wealth, it was about making a difference, no matter how late it seemed. When evening fell, he went back to Daniel. "You and your mother have reminded me of something important," he said softly. "Life is not about how much you take, it's about how much you give, and the lives you touch along the way." Daniel smiled, the weight of the morning's journey slowly lifting from his small shoulders. "My mother wanted you to know that, sir," he said. Jonathan looked at the silver key once more, turning it slowly between his fingers. The key had opened more than a door, it had opened his heart. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt complete. Even with only hours left, he had found peace, understanding, and purpose. He realized that the end of his life wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity to leave behind something far greater than any fortune, a life that inspired hope, kindness, and change. And as night fell over the city, Jonathan Hale smiled for the first time in years, feeling that even in the face of death, it was never too late to make a difference. Jonathan Hale woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the enormous windows of his mansion. The city below was alive as always, but for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to control it. For decades, he had measured life in profits, contracts, and influence. But now, with only hours remaining, he measured it differently, by purpose, connection, and the chance to make a meaningful difference before he was gone. Daniel sat nearby, quietly watching Jonathan. The boy had been calm and determined from the moment he arrived, but now there was a subtle sense of relief in his small posture, as if he could feel the transformation happening in front of him. Jonathan held the silver key, turning it slowly between his fingers. It was more than metal, it was a symbol, a bridge between past and present, a reminder that one small act of kindness could ripple through decades and touch countless lives. Jonathan began his final work with deliberate intent. He contacted foundations, orphanages, and shelters, ensuring Maria's place would not only survive but thrive. He allocated funds, created plans for scholarships, and arranged for support systems for families and children who had nowhere else to turn. For each decision, he felt a sense of satisfaction deeper than anything his wealth or power had ever provided. He also reached out to people he had wronged or ignored over the years. There were apologies, reconciliations, and offers of assistance. These acts didn't bring back lost time, but they mended broken threads in a tapestry of human connection. He realized that wealth without empathy left life hollow, but compassion could leave an enduring mark far beyond what money could buy. As the sun set, casting warm gold across the mansion, Jonathan sat with Daniel once more. "You know," he said softly, "I spent my life thinking I needed power to matter. But the truth is in what we give, not what we take. Even a small gesture can change someone's life forever." Daniel smiled faintly, understanding the lesson that had taken decades for Jonathan to learn. "My mother always said that, sir," he said. Jonathan nodded, feeling a profound peace. His empire, his fortune, and his influence were no longer the measures of his life. What mattered was the ripple effect of his actions, the kindness that had returned to him through Daniel, and the hope he was leaving behind. When Jonathan's final moments came, he was not alone. He was surrounded by purpose, by meaning, and by the knowledge that he had touched lives that would continue to flourish long after he was gone. His death was quiet, yet it carried weight, not of wealth, not of power, but of legacy. Daniel held the small silver key close, the symbol of a story that had begun with a single act of kindness decades ago. Jonathan Hale's life, once defined by ambition, was now remembered for compassion, impact, and the extraordinary power of one human connection. And in the hearts of those who had been touched by him, Jonathan lived on, proof that even in the final hours, a life could change the world.